So here I'm going to be doing a series of videos about how to improve taking photos on your smartphone. So I hope you enjoy, and I'm looking forward to seeing what you produce. So I want you to tell me, what is photography? Have a think about it. What is photography? Okay, so photography is a way of capturing light, okay? So if you think about it, you know from your science lessons that we are able to see because light is bounces off an object and bounces into our eyes, okay? So that's exactly how photographs are taken. So it's the light is bouncing off an object and it's going into the camera, and in one moment in time when you press that button, the photo's taken. Okay, so think about that when we're going over the next few videos, because a lot of what I'm going to teach you is about how the light is manipulated, okay, to take different types of photos. So all photos depend on these three things. So shutter speed, aperture, and the ISO, okay? So don't worry in particular about what they mean, because all those words are quite hard. Today we're going to talk about the aperture, okay? So the aperture means the opening. And it's the opening, as you can see from these circles at the bottom, that is the camera, and it's the opening to the lens, and how open it is, and how you can adapt those openings and how you can manipulate them to take different types of photos. So the aperture is a little bit like the iris of your eye. So the iris is the coloured part, okay? When it is really, really bright outside, the iris contracts so that it's so it makes the pupil become very, very small, okay? And that is exactly what happens with the camera. Because it's very, very bright, it contracts, it makes the pupil particularly small so that less light can enter into your eye. Because if it didn't do that, you would be blinded by the light. On the other side, you can see that when it's in dim conditions, dim light or dark, it's dark outside, the iris relaxes. It means that the pupil, okay, the black bit in the middle, is much larger. It allows more light to enter into your eye so that you can see more in the dark. Okay, so think about that when we're talking about aperture. So, as you can see here, we have a whole bunch of apertures, and these are the openings in the cameras. And they go from being particularly wide to being narrow. And think about it like the iris that I've just shown you. So aperture is measured in something called an f-stop or an f number. So you can see all these numbers above, f, and then the number correlates to the size of the opening of the aperture. So if the number's very small, like on the left-hand side here, we've got 1.4, it means that the opening, the aperture, is really wide, which is very confusing, I know, but we just have to stick with it. If on the other side, you can see that the number's very high, the f-stop is f22, you can see that the aperture is really, really small. So why is this important? So if you have a very wide aperture or a low number, it allows more light into the camera, but it means that less of what you're pointing your camera at is in focus, okay? And what we would say is it's a shallow depth of field. So the only thing that there might only be one or two items that are particularly at the front of the image that are in focus, and everything else behind it is blurry. Whereas on the other side, where the aperture is narrow, it's got a higher f-stop, so here f22, you can see that not as much light gets into the camera. It means that more of what you can see in your photo is in focus and it's not blurry, and it gives a deeper depth of field. And what that means is that everything from the items at the front, the objects at the front of the image, to those that are going further back, so further away from where you've taken the photo, it means all of those are in focus, okay? And photographers use this as a creative outlet. So they decide, well, I'm going to take a portrait of a person and I would love it if their face is in focus, but everything behind is blurry. They choose to have a wide aperture, okay? And that's what is resulted. That's the result of using a wide aperture, okay? So here, another way of thinking about aperture is the fact that when you've got a large aperture, as we said, like the iris, it relaxes, there's a larger opening, it allows more light in. So here on the left hand side, it's the same image on both sides, but the one on the left, it is much lighter because more light has been able to hit the lens in the camera. Whereas on the right hand side, it's much smaller, and it means that less light gets in, so the image is much darker. So when you're taking a picture, you have to really think, is it dark in here? Do I need to make sure that the aperture or the opening is wider so that I can let more light in? Or is it already quite bright in the room, and would a smaller aperture work for what I want? Again, on the left-hand side, we've got the large aperture. So we've got a wide opening. And you can see of this lizard, his face is in focus, but the rest is all blurry. And on the right-hand side, so that is a smaller aperture, it's much narrower. Everything in the picture is in focus. Okay? So if you were wanting to play around with the aperture, if you've got an iPhone, this is how you get into it. So you would open up the camera app on your iPhone. At the bottom, there's a whole bunch of options, and you would want to choose the portrait mode. This is for a Samsung. So when you're in your camera, at the top left-hand side, you can see there's the 3 lines, which usually bring up a menu. When you click on that, you then open up your settings. And then within your settings, you will find the aperture you're able to adapt the aperture. And this is in a Google Pixel phone. And it's the same if you want to open up your camera app, find the settings, and then you can either use portrait mode or you can go into settings, okay? So I took some pictures at home yesterday, and I went in, I've got an iPhone, so I opened up the camera app. I went into portrait, and in the top right hand side, you can see there's that funny little F for f-stop and then the number 1.4. Can you remember what 1.4 means? Does that mean that it's a particularly wide aperture, very wide opening, or is it very, very small? Excellent. So it means that it's really, really wide. Okay. You can then click on that F number, that F stop, and at the bottom, a little slider comes up and you're able to change the number. So you can see here that this is 2.8. So that means that even though the number's getting bigger, the aperture, the hole is getting smaller. So if I'm just going to go back a step, that's 1.4. And that's 2.8. You should be able to see the difference in some of those images, because if you look at this one, the 1.4, you can see the leaves at the front are in focus. But if you look at the camera in the background, sorry, not the camera, the radio in the background, and the map that's on the wall, that's all really, really blurry. Whereas if you go to the 2.8, that radio in the background is a little bit more in focus and more of the leaves are in focus. And then I've moved it up even further, so the hole is getting smaller. I've put onto the F9, and we can see that the radio is in more or less in focus, and most of the leaves are in focus. So have a look in your phone, go into your camera app, have a look around for aperture. You might need to go into portrait mode, like I've shown you. It depends what kind of phone you've got. And you want to be playing around with the f-stop number. And this is what I'd like you to do. I'd like you to go around and, like I took a picture of a plant. It doesn't have to be a plant. You could even do it of a tin of beans. You could do it of a bottle of water. You could do it of the remote control for your TV. And I'd like you to take a bunch of photos. And what I'd like you to do is change the aperture. Okay, so what I need you to remember though is if you're taking photos in low lighting, so if it's dark or dim or it's dusky outside, make sure that your aperture is wide. So you need it to have a low f-stop number, and that means that more light will enter into the lens, which means that it'll brighten up your photograph. If you want your item to be in focus with a blurry background, use a wide aperture. So again, it's another low f-stop number. So that means that you're going to have a shallow depth of field, which means that the item at the front of your photo is going to be in focus, but everything else behind it is going to be blurred. And similarly, if you want everything in your photo to be in focus, you need to do the opposite of what you've just done. So if you want to be able to see everything really, really clearly, you need to use a narrow aperture, which is a high f-stop number. So what I'd love you to do is just take a whole range of photos, and I'd like you to send them to me, my email address, and then I would like you to try and label them. Say this one has got a wide aperture or it's got a narrow aperture, and explain why you've done it, because that's really going to help you improve taking your photos. All right, I'm really looking forward to seeing you guys. I hope this has been useful, and keep an eye out for the next video. Great, take care, bye.